Have you ever been in a place in your life when it seemed it was impossible to see how God could bring anything good out of the situation? You ever been there? I think most of us have been there. At one time, may be there right now. And we all probably have heard the words written by Paul in Romans 8:28, right? And you go, oh goodness, you're going to say that one too? And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them. And, we get all excited when we see the end result. We'll get to the end. However, many times as we are in that difficult situation, it's hard to see any good, right? It's hard to see any good, and it is actually hard to have joy inside about it. I don't know what you think about the story of Joseph, but I'm sure that in all of the different situations that he experienced, it brought up a lot of different emotions throughout his life. We brought them up in him, in his dad, in his brothers, in his owners, and in his subjects. But in the middle of it all, God was working in the very fabric of his life. I'm sure that you remember those two dreams we just read about. And his brothers thought they were totally outrageous. You see, they correctly interpreted the dreams. They knew what it was all about. And they were not at all pleased with that interpretation. Or it was very clear to them that they would have to bow down before their brother at some point. And because he was their father's favorite, just the thought of bowing down made them furious. You know, when you were young, if you had siblings, if one of them was kind of the favorite, you certainly didn't want to have to mess with putting them on a pedestal. Well, you can kind of understand how these guys were feeling. These weren't children, though, okay? Yeah, Joseph was the young one, or the younger. The rest of them were much older than him. They weren't very happy about the fact that his dream said they were going to bow down. The second dream about the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing before him was even ridiculed by his dad. And although his brothers became jealous of Joseph, his father, Jacob, thought about it and wondered, what in the world does this mean? It reminded me, when I read that, it reminded me of something that's written in the New Testament about Mary. And she pondered all these things in her heart. She didn't know what to think of all the things. But Jacob wondered what all these dreams meant. I wonder sometimes what Joseph thought about those dreams. I think he probably agreed with the interpretation. And he probably felt really good about it, But I wonder if he frequently stopped and thought about those dreams. Who knows? When a person is 17 years old and all of life is ahead of them, then that individual begins to have great dreams about the future and how their lives are going to turn out, right? But then Joseph's dreams came smashing down on the day when he found his brothers taking care of their sheep over in a town or in an area called Dothan. They had had their fill of Joseph and his high place in their father's eyes. They were exhausted at his being the favorite son of their dad. And they made up their minds to get rid of him just as quickly as possible. They were so angry with him that at first they thought, let's just kill him. It'll be done, just kill him. And then they thought, maybe that's not good. So they did not do that, but they did sell him to some traders that were headed for Egypt. Good riddance, right? Don't have to worry about that kid again. And then they made up a story about him being killed by a wild animal, and they sold that story to their dad by covering his coat of many colors in blood. I think they were shocked about how their story affected their dad. He believed them. Jacob was so totally covered with grief that the scripture tells us that not only did he tear his clothes and put on burlap, but he mourned deeply for Joseph for a long time. No matter what his other sons said, he was convinced that he was going to die mourning for Joseph. And then he would sit down and weep some more. You could say that the man was in a rough place. Very rough place. But can you imagine how it affected Joseph? Those dreams had probably led him to believe that he was going to rule over his brothers and the entire household by some kind of something that would happen while he was living at home. And it was going to, he was just going to be right there, but he was going to be over all of them. But now he was sold, and I'm confident that he thought he would never, ever see his dad again, nor ever see his younger brother Benjamin. I think it's amazing this 17-year-old chose to keep his integrity. He chose to have moral courage, and he kept believing in God, Jehovah, despite all of the adversity. That's something, folks. Some of us that are quite a few years older than 17 have some difficulty with that every once in a while. Come on now. But to think about a 17-year-old who's able to stand there even in the middle of the difficulties and hang on, keep holding on to his integrity and his moral courage and his knowledge of who God is. No, he worked for Potiphar. Ultimately, he was put in charge of, and Potiphar's household prospered. Potiphar got richer because Joseph was in charge. From the story, it appears that he never even thought about cheating his first owner, Potiphar. It came to the point, if you've read the story, it came to the point that Potiphar didn't do anything but come home and, relax. Joseph was in charge of everything. And it certainly never appears that he ever considered having sex with his owner's wife, despite the fact that she did everything she could to change his mind. She got so mad, so unhappy, that she made up a story against Joseph because she couldn't get him to do what she wanted to do. And as a result, Joseph ended up in prison. And you imagine, your brother sold you because they hate your guts. You go to work, taken care of, you get all kinds of praise, you get all kinds of opportunities, and then because you won't do something that his wife wants, you go to prison. Wow. Can you imagine how he felt? He was trying to do all the right things, but he still got into trouble. All those great dreams that he had had about his future seemed to be thrown into a fire and burned up. But he chose, hear me, he chose to keep his integrity, his moral courage, and his belief in the God of creation. Now, there's another story that actually is in Genesis 38. There's another story that has some of the same overtones. One of Joseph's brothers, his name was Judah, he left home sometime after Joseph was sold. And Judah moved to a town that was just a few miles from where Jacob was living, it was a Canaanite town, though. And Judah ended up marrying a Canaanite woman. The scriptures don't tell us, though, that Jacob was unhappy about that move. But I'm sure that you remember that Abraham was absolutely determined that his son Isaac should not marry a Canaanite woman. Remember that? Let me take you down a bunny trail for a second, because I want you to know why. The reason why Abraham did not want him to marry a Canaanite woman is because Abraham didn't want the gods of Canaan to rub off on his son Isaac. Okay? We need to know that. Parents, you need to guide your children's feet so that they marry people who believe in the same God that you believe in. Help me now. I'm telling you, pain comes when folks who love the Lord run off and get married with somebody who doesn't love the Lord. Anyway, Abraham didn't want all the wickedness of the inhabitants of Canaan to become the habits of his descendants, and he knew that's what would happen. So now let's get back to this story. I'm sure you remember that Isaac's wife, Rebekah, didn't want Jacob marrying a woman from Canaan, and that was one of the reasons that she was able to get Isaac to send Jacob back to her brother's home. And now Jacob's son, Judah, married a Canaanite woman. Let's skip forward a few years, and we find that Judah's oldest and second oldest sons, listen to me, were both killed by God because of their wickedness. Now, parents, that has to be a hard blow. Huh? They were both killed. The scripture tells us very specifically that they were killed by God because they were wicked. And Judah's daughter-in-law then, Tamar, had no children to carry on her husband's name, and that was really important. That was very, very important in those days. Judah told her to go back to her dad's house and wait for his third son to get old enough to marry. However, the reality is that Judah didn't intend for that third son to marry Tamar. Now, okay? Can you imagine the humiliation that Tamar suffered as she was being sent back to her father's house, and then never hearing from Judah again so that she could get married to his son? I don't think we can imagine it, because it's not the same in our culture. But that was terrible. She had no children. And she was being humiliated when she was sent back to her dad's house. Bad deal. Now, Judah's wife died, and a bit later, Tamar discovered that Judah didn't fulfill his promise to have his youngest son marry her. And she heard that Judah was going to be passing by town on his way to and from the place where his sheep were being sheared. So she decided to take matters into her own hand. How many of you remember the story? Okay, a few of you. All right. She took matters into her own hands. She took off her widow's clothes because they had specific clothing that they wore as a widow. She took those off and she disguised herself as a shrine prostitute. And then she covered her face and sat outside the town. That day, Judah came by and noticed her, and he propositioned her, not realizing that this was his daughter-in-law, Tamar. To pay her, he gave her his identification seal, cord, and his walking stick. Now, she asked for those things because he didn't have anything in his pocket to pay her with. So she asked for those things. Why? Because those things identified that man. You can't get out of that one. He told her that he would retrieve those things when he delivered to her a young goat that would be in payment for her services. Okay, so Tamar got pregnant. And when it was obvious that she was pregnant, someone told Judah that Tamar was pregnant. And he got really mad. He still didn't know who the woman was. He got really mad and he said, she needs to be killed, because you see, in those days, the leader of the tribe determined when somebody would be killed, or if they should be killed. And he was convinced that she should die because she committed adultery. Now, Pastor Ann, how did she commit adultery? I mean, her husband was dead. She committed adultery because he had promised that she would marry his third son. So she was engaged. Right? But just as the people were taking her to kill her, she sent her father-in-law, Judah, this message and said, the man who owns these things is the man who made me pregnant. Look closely, whose seal and cord and walking stick are these? Like I said, she had him. And that's the day when Judah's ivory tower collapsed as Tamar's dream of removing the humiliation, those two things crashed together. Judah looked at the items and he declared that Tamar was more righteous than him because he had refused to keep his word to her about marrying his youngest son. Now, a few months later, she has twins. The oldest one was named Paris, and the younger one was named Zerah. And although we don't hear anything more about her in the Old Testament, she evidently moved back into the tents of his tribe. Okay, she was once again under his protection. Now we hear of her sons in Genesis 46, where all of the children of Jacob's 12 sons are listed. And then we read again about them in Numbers chapter 26, verse 20. And we also hear of them in Ruth chapter 4, verse 18. Because Perez was the ancestor of Boaz and Jesse, the father of David. Now there's one more story I want to remember here. It's the story of a young teenage girl who lived in Nazareth. She was engaged to a man who also lived in Nazareth. But one day, A messenger came from God and spoke to her. He greeted her and told her that Jehovah was pouring out grace in abundance on her. The verse calls it favored woman. She was taken aback trying to figure out what the messenger meant when he was said all of these things. And finally he told her, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He told her that she had found favor with God and she was going to have a baby. He even told her the name of the child and what the child would do. She's a young teenage girl. And I think she just kind of shook her head. I mean, this is my imagination, y'all. It's not in the scriptures. Don't quote me. She just kind of shook her head and thought, how can this be? I'm still a virgin. The messenger, Gabriel, told her that this would happen how? By the power of the Most High God. And amazingly, Mary accepted his statement. However, life had just become extremely complicated. You see, at that time, a woman who was engaged could be stoned if she had sex with anyone before marriage. In fact, God had to show up in a dream for Joseph so that he wouldn't break off the engagement. No one understood how in the world she could be pregnant and still be a virgin. I think there's probably only two people who believed her. One of them was Joseph, because God showed up in a dream. And the other one was Elizabeth, her cousin. Otherwise, Mary was probably treated as an outcast by everyone else. Are you with me? So Mary went and stayed with her cousin for 3 months before returning to Nazareth. And she was probably at Elizabeth's home when John was born. But then she had to go home. Would she stay in her household, in the house, all the time, so nobody could see her? I don't know. Did she hear all the derogatory whispers about her? I don't know. But the people in the town probably thought Joseph was crazy. Their question was, why in the world would he stay with somebody who cheated on him? And then you have a Roman emperor named Augustus. And he made this big announcement that everybody had to go back to their ancestors' hometown in order to register there for a census and to be taxed. Now, the trip from Nazareth, which is up north, it's about the same level as the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to Bethlehem, which is just a tad bit southeast of Jerusalem. That trip was about 70 miles as a crow flies. And it's not a bad trip at all today if you're driving a vehicle. It's not bad at all. But walking or riding on a donkey made it a very difficult trip. Now, if I had been Mary, I would have been pretty frustrated and depressed before I ever started that trip. Okay, I'm just human. I'm just telling you, that would have been not one of the things that I wanted to do. Even knowing that what was happening in my life was from God would not take away from the embarrassment and the humiliation that I would have felt when it was obvious that I was pregnant, but not by Joseph. Now, add on the physical pain Ladies, you know what I'm talking about if you've had children. Add on the physical pain of being close to 9 months pregnant and having to make that trip on the back of a donkey. Oh, by the way, did you know it doesn't say she rode a donkey in the scripture? Somebody just put that in there. But can you imagine what if she and Joseph had to walk the whole way? I'm surprised she didn't have that baby early, to tell you the truth. Okay, so what do these three stories have in common? What do these three stories have in common? The story of Joseph and the crushing of his dreams, the story of Tamar and the humiliation dumped on her by her father-in-law Judah, and the story of Mary. What do they all have in common? Well, perhaps there's a couple of things that we can pull out. The first one is what you're expecting in life, even if it is directed by God, and you know that, may not play out the way that you are expecting it to play out. All the integrity and moral courage and trust in Jehovah did not cause Joseph to have an easy life. In fact, in some ways, it made it even more difficult. Tamar knew the laws and knew that Judah had done her wrong in not giving her to his youngest son. And as a result, she tricked him so that she could have the humiliation removed from her. Mary heard from Gabriel, the messenger of God, and yet she had a very difficult road to walk before her son Jesus was born. I'm not sure that she really expected things to be as harsh as they became. And that was just up to his birth. Here's a difficult truth. It is very possible that when we choose to walk in God's ways, we may have some very rough times. I heard a man say this, God is not, oh, this is hard. God is not in the business of making our lives easy on earth. You know, that's stark contrast to what we think most of the time, isn't it? We really think that if we are followers of Jesus, everything ought to just come up roses. Tiptoe through the tulips or something like that. Sure ought to be good. This man went on to say, God often messes up our life plans to carry out His purposes and make us what we need to become for His glory. God is all about receiving the glory. And whatever that takes, God is willing to do. Ouch. Lord, that hurts. I really would like it a little easier. Second thing that we can get from these three stories is that we probably can't see how God is accomplishing His purposes. When we're in the middle of it, we probably can't see how He is accomplishing His purposes. I'm sure that Joseph would have had a lot to say about the horrible situations and horrible conditions that he lived through in his life. You know, it doesn't tell us about it in Genesis, but over in Psalms 105, verses 17 to 19, we read this. Then He, talking about God, then He sent someone to Egypt ahead of them. Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar. Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. It didn't say it happened just once. It says until the time came for those dreams to be fulfilled, God was testing his character. He had dreams, but his life was filled, at least at this point, with pain and suffering and false accusations and heartaches. Tamar certainly was unable to see how any of her troubles were going to turn into something beautiful. She certainly was unable to see that her son, Peretz, was going to be one of the, are you ready for this? One of the forefathers of the Messiah, Jesus. However, if you look in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3, you will find this, something similar. Right? Judah was the father of Peretz and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Peretz was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. And the chapter goes on to list Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David, Solomon, just to name a few, before it gets down to Jesus. Can you imagine all of the pain she went through and all the stuff that she did? And she was in the line, her son was in the line of the Messiah. Wow. And Mary was astonished that the messenger came to her in the first place. I think I would have been saying, no, what are you doing here? Why in the world would God choose her? And then you look at all the societal criticism and probably being an outcast from all of her friends. Folks, this was a big deal. Those things were very hard. And I can imagine that despite the fact that her pregnancy was only for 9 months, it seemed like it lasted for years. So I want to encourage us all that even when we can't see that things are working out for the glory of God, He is still working. He is still working. He hasn't stopped. What we see as we're going through the challenges may look like ashes from the burned dreams, the dreams that have just been burned up. But in the end, we will see the beauty that He has brought. In Isaiah 61, verse 3, the prophet said that He had been sent to all who mourn in Israel, because Jehovah will give them a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. You see, joy comes in the morning. The song says, weeping only lasts for the night. Although it may seem like it's many, 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 many years of nights, joy comes in the morning. So hold on to God and trust His ways, even when you cannot see the end of the journey, because the joy comes in the morning. Amen.